I knew something was off the second I saw Karren Wickley's leopard print heels sinking into the mud by the lake. She stood there like she owned the place, arms crossed, sunglasses too big for her face, and that same smug look she wore every time the HOA tried to flex on one of us. I was halfway through replacing some rotted boards on my dock when she called out, "Elias, we need to talk, now." I wiped sweat from my brow and looked up. "Unless it's about your car blocking my driveway again, I'm not interested." She ignored that. There was a vote at last night's emergency HOA meeting. "We've decided to drain the lake for safety reasons. It's a liability. Someone could drown." I blinked. "It's a private lake, my lake. You can't touch it." Karren gave a fake laugh. "It's within HOA jurisdiction, Elias." Page 97 of the bylaws. Section 17, paragraph 3. Natural water features posing a safety risk may be mitigated at the board's discretion. "Mitigated?" I asked, stepping off the dock. "You mean destroyed?" She didn't flinch. "Drained, effective immediately." "We've already hired a contractor. Pumps go in tomorrow." That was the first time in years I actually felt my jaw tighten. "You do realize I own the lake, right? Not the HOA, me. I bought it with the property. It's on the deed." Karren smiled like a crocodile. "It's for the greater good, Elias. We can't risk a lawsuit because some kid falls in. Besides, it's not like anyone actually uses it." I stared at her. "You've lived here for what, 5 months? That lake's been in use since the 70s. People fish here, paddleboard. My nephew learned to swim in it." She shrugged. "Doesn't matter." "It's happening." And it did. Less than 24 hours later, I woke up to the sound of roaring engines and saw a crew dragging hoses down to the waterline. By the end of the week, the lake was a muddy crater, frogs flipping around in ankle-deep sludge, fish gone, the dock sitting there like a broken rib. They even put up a little HOA-approved sign, "Lake Closed Indefinitely Safety Compliance Initiative." I didn't yell. I didn't protest. I just watched. And then I made a phone call. See, what Karren didn't know was that about 2 years ago, I'd started looking into the dam on the far end of the lake, the one that regulated the water levels. It was technically owned by a private company that had gone bankrupt. I'd offered to buy it for a song. Now, with the lake drained, it finally clicked. I called my lawyer. "Remember that dam paperwork? Let's finalize it." By Friday, the dam and control of the water that flowed into the HOA's irrigation canals was mine, and I had plans. Big ones. By the time Monday rolled around, the HOA's landscapers were already complaining about pressure issues in their irrigation system. I knew, because one of them, Mark, a guy I'd coached in Little League 15 years ago, knocked on my door looking pale and nervous. "They told me to check the valve by the pump house," he said, hands shoved deep in his vest pockets. "But the water's barely trickling. You got any idea what's going on?" I kept my expression neutral. "You might want to ask your board. They've been making a lot of decisions lately without checking who owns what." He shifted uncomfortably. "I just maintain the turf, man. I didn't sign up for a war." "Then stay out of it," I said, stepping back inside. I didn't need to say more. The moment I signed ownership papers on the dam, I had also filed a control plan with the county's Water Resource Authority. It gave me full legal discretion over flow levels for environmental protection. In other words, if I wanted to reduce the output to a trickle for ecosystem recovery, I was entirely within my rights. By Tuesday, the HOA's pristine front lawns were starting to brown, and their flower beds drooped like overcooked spinach. The community clubhouse, which used lake-filtered water for its decorative fountains, sat dry and silent. The board sent out a notice blaming unexpected mechanical issues with the irrigation system. I saved a copy of that memo. Wednesday evening brought my first visitor from the board since the lake was drained. Not Karren this time, it was Tom Mallory, the HOA treasurer. He was less peacock and more pigeon, always trying to play both sides without getting his feathers ruffled. "You got a minute to talk?" he asked, glancing at the security camera above my porch. I nodded but didn't invite him in. He didn't deserve that courtesy. He cleared his throat. Look, Elias, I know things have gotten tense. The board may have acted a little too fast with the lake. We're reviewing the decision now. Little late for that, isn't it? He scratched the back of his neck. Honestly, we didn't realize the dam was privately owned, thought it was county managed. You didn't realize a 400-foot concrete structure was privately owned, he winced. We made a mistake. We're hoping we can work something out, maybe a water-sharing agreement. We'll pay for access, seasonal flow, just enough to keep the common areas green. I leaned against the doorframe. You'll need to file a formal request through my attorney. You're being serious, Deadly. He hesitated. If this goes on, the board's going to get pressure from the residents. We can't risk property values dropping. Maybe you should have thought of that before you turned my lake into a ditch. He left without another word. That Friday, I got a certified letter from the HOA's legal firm. They claimed I was intentionally disrupting community infrastructure and violating cooperative development expectations. Their closing line was a masterpiece of passive aggression. We urge you to consider the legal consequences of withholding a shared natural resource from the homeowners association. I sent them a scanned copy of the deed to the lake, title to the dam, and the county's water flow permit number. I highlighted the section that said exclusive private control. My attorney added a note, cease further threats or we file for harassment. That weekend, something shifted. I noticed Karren's Range Rover parked outside the clubhouse for over 3 hours longer than any board meeting should have taken. That night, 3 residents stopped me while I was walking my dog. They weren't subtle. "Hey, Elias," said Mrs. Barlow from 2 doors down. "Is it true the HOA drained the lake without your permission?" "Because we were told it was a safety emergency," added her husband, squinting like he was trying to read between invisible lines. I didn't lie. They never asked. They just showed up with pumps and claimed they had jurisdiction. The third neighbor, a retired biology professor named Lorna, frowned. That lake supported an entire migratory bird route. I've logged over 50 species there for the state survey, and now it's gone. I nodded, kept walking. By Monday, the community buzz had turned. Someone, probably Lorna, had started sharing aerial photos from before and after the drainage. They spread fast. People were angry now, not just about the dead landscaping, but about the way it had all gone down. Karren doubled down, of course. She sent out a board clarification bulletin claiming that draining the lake had been necessary due to recent liability assessments, and that I was withholding critical resources out of spite. That backfired. Because the next day, Channel 7's local news van showed up. I hadn't called them. Someone else had. By the time I got home from work, a reporter was standing on my dried-out dock, microphone in hand, panning to the cracked lakebed behind her. We're here in Brookridge Estates, where a controversial decision by the Homeowners Association has sparked outrage among residents and environmental advocates. They requested an interview. I declined, but I gave them a folder. Inside, the deed to the lake, the purchase record for the dam, the water permit, and a timeline of HOA actions. I didn't need to say a word. That night the segment aired. It wasn't flattering. Footage of the drained lake played over a voiceover. Despite being privately owned, the HOA initiated drainage without verified ownership rights or environmental review. The lakebed has since dried out, killing local wildlife and disrupting the area's microclimate. The next morning, 2 unmarked sedans and a state environmental officer showed up at the clubhouse. That's when it got real. Because draining a lake, especially one supporting migratory species, without filing an environmental impact report is a violation of both state and federal law. The HOA had bypassed that entirely. And when the officer requested documents proving their authority to alter the water body, Karren had nothing to offer but the bylaws, which meant they were in violation of the Clean Water Act. It took less than 48 hours for the Department of Fish and Wildlife to post an official notice. Site under investigation for unauthorized environmental alteration. I watched them tape it to the clubhouse door. That night, the board held an emergency meeting. Not in the clubhouse because it was now sealed, but in Karren's backyard, under a string of drooping patio lights. They didn't even invite the neighborhood, but they forgot one thing: I live on the ridge above her, and sound travels. I sat on my back deck, beer in hand, listening to chairs scrape and voices rise. We're going to get sued. They're saying we need a remediation plan. Do you know how much that costs? Why didn't you verify the land rights before acting? Karren's voice cut through the noise. He never said he owned it. Because you never asked. Silence followed. That was the night the board fractured. 3 members resigned within the week, citing irreconcilable governance breakdown. Residents started demanding a full audit of HOA decisions. A petition circulated to dissolve the current board entirely. Karren clung to her position like the last chair on a sinking ship, but the tide was already pulling her under. Meanwhile, I started restoring the lake. Slowly. I brought in an ecologist. We reintroduced native plants, aerated the soil, and began refilling the basin naturally, letting rain and controlled flow from the dam do the work. It would take time, but it would come back better than before. And this time, no one would touch it without my say. I was down by the waterline early Thursday morning when 2 county officers showed up in khaki uniforms, stepping carefully around newly planted bulrushes. One of them carried a clipboard, the other a camera slung around his neck. They didn't need to introduce themselves. I'd been expecting them since the environmental notice went up. The taller one scanned the area. "You're Mr. Elias Hart?" I nodded and gestured toward the recovering basin. "That's me. You here to document the damage?" He flipped open the clipboard. "We're starting the site assessment for the remediation order. Fish and Wildlife will send their own team for the aquatic impact, but we're covering structural and flow disruption." His partner crouched by the edge, taking photos of the cracked mud, the exposed roots, and the torn-up inlets where the pumps had been dropped. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The evidence was everywhere. The taller one asked, "You have any documentation on the drainage event? Names, dates, permits, that kind of thing?" "They didn't use permits," I said. "I've got emails from the board, a copy of the HOA bulletin they sent out announcing the drainage, and security footage of the contractors arriving." He scribbled something, then paused. "We're also investigating whether they violated any water diversion statutes. Redirecting a natural water source without state approval, that's felony territory." I raised an eyebrow. "That's serious." "Depends on what we find," he said. "But if they tampered with the outflow structure or altered the water level without coordination with the water authority, they're in deep." He handed me a card. "If you remember anything else, give us a call." They left just as a pair of residents wandered up the slope, arms full of buckets. It was the Gomeses' quiet folks from the north end of the development. They didn't say much, just waved and started planting water lilies from their own pond into the shallows, moving with the care of people who knew how to rebuild something broken. That afternoon, I got a call from a civil engineer named Dana who'd been sent by the county to inspect the dam itself. She was sharp, fast-talking, and didn't waste time handing out warnings. "Just so you're aware," she said, adjusting her hard hat as we crossed the spillway, "the HOA's actions may have compromised downstream sediment control. If they touch this outflow without authorization, they'll be liable for restoration. Possibly fines, too." "How much do you think they drained?" "About 6 feet off the full level," I said. "Took them less than 48 hours. She let out a low whistle. "That's not just negligent, that's reckless." By Friday, the county had filed for a temporary injunction against the HOA. They were barred from initiating any more infrastructure interventions until the investigation was complete. That alone would have been a win. But then something unexpected happened. A man in a charcoal gray suit and mirrored sunglasses showed up at my door. He introduced himself as Special Agent Redmond with the Office of the Inspector General, Environmental Crimes Division. He held up a badge. "We're coordinating with the state attorney's office." We believe your HOA may have falsified environmental documents to expedite the drainage. I leaned against the doorframe. Falsified, he nodded. We pulled their filings. They submitted an emergency aquatic mitigation request to the county's planning department using a forged environmental impact waiver. The signature on the waiver belongs to a biologist who hasn't worked for the state in over a year. I stared at him. You're telling me they forged a state scientist's signature? Correct. And the contractor they hired to perform the drainage was paid using HOA reserve funds under a misrepresented line item labeled stormwater debris removal. I stepped aside and let him in. Over the next 2 hours, Redmond laid out the beginnings of what looked less like regulatory overreach and more like outright criminal fraud. The board had bypassed every formal approval process, submitted forged documentation, and misused community funds to carry out an environmentally destructive act, one they couldn't legally justify. He handed me a copy of the falsified waiver. We'll need a sworn affidavit from you about the ownership of the lake and dam, as well as any communications you had with the board leading up to the drainage. I gave it to him. That night, subpoenas were issued for the HOA board's financial records. The clubhouse, still taped off by environmental authorities, was officially designated a restricted site. Karren and the remaining board members were served notices of investigation. I heard she tried to call an emergency vote to appoint a legal defense fund using HOA dues, but it was shut down immediately by the interim treasurer, a retired aerospace accountant named Linda who'd had enough of the whole circus. I didn't hear from Karren for a few days. Then on Sunday morning she showed up at my house. She didn't bother with pleasantries. I hope you're satisfied, she snapped, standing rigid at the edge of my driveway. You've turned the neighborhood against us. I looked up from the hose I was using to water a patch of wildgrass by the dock. You did that yourself. You think this is justice? You think you're a hero for shutting off our water? I didn't shut off anything. I followed the law. You didn't. Her arms crossed. You could have worked with us. But instead, you let this become a witch hunt. You forged state documents, drained a protected habitat, and spent other people's money to do it. This isn't a witch hunt. It's the consequences of your own arrogance. She glared, but her voice cracked when she spoke. You don't understand the pressure we're under. The board was trying to stay ahead of liability. Do you know how easy it is for someone to sue over an unsupervised lake? Then you should have gone through the proper channels. You don't get to rewrite property law because you're afraid of a lawsuit. She stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked away. Her heels didn't sink this time. The grass was too dry. The next week brought a cascade of fallout. The state attorney filed preliminary charges against the HOA president and 2 remaining board members: falsification of public records, misuse of funds, and unlawful environmental modification. The biologist whose signature had been forged gave a televised interview, calling the act the most flagrant abuse of environmental protocol I've ever seen in a residential setting. Residents held a community meeting at the local library, since the clubhouse was officially off-limits. Over 80 people showed up. Linda stood at the front with a microphone and a stack of printed board minutes from the last 12 months. We were lied to, she said. Funds were misallocated, decisions were made behind closed doors, and legal protocols were completely ignored. They voted to dissolve the current HOA board and called for a full forensic audit. A committee was formed to draft new oversight procedures, including a clause that prohibited any structural changes to shared property without a 2/3 vote and third-party verification. As for the lake, it began to heal. The water level rose slowly, naturally, fed by spring runoff and controlled releases from the dam. The wildlife began to return. The frogs sang at night again. A pair of herons nested in the reeds. I kept the security cameras up, but the foot traffic changed. People came not to interfere, but to help. They brought bulbs, native seeds, and even a pair of floating duck habitats someone had welded from scrap. Mark, the landscaper, returned with a few volunteers and helped reseed the banks. He never said much, just handed me a cold drink and got to work. By midsummer, the lake had regained nearly half its depth. It would take a full year to fully recover, but it was on the right track, and the dam, still mine, still locked. But I filed paperwork to establish a permanent conservation easement around the lake and inflow channels, legally barring any future HOA, developer, or contractor from altering it without my written consent, and a certified environmental survey. No more backdoor meetings. No more forged signatures. No more bulldozers in the night. They drained the lake to control it. Now it controlled them. The courtroom wasn't as dramatic as I'd imagined. No wood-paneled walls or judge banging a gavel for order. Just pale tile, a flickering fluorescent bulb, and the low hum of whispered side conversations. Still, it was the most important room in Brookridge Estates that day. I sat on the left side of the gallery, beside my attorney, watching the final hearing unfold. Across the aisle, Karren sat stone-faced between her lawyer and the now former secretary of the HOA board, who hadn't spoken a word since the indictment. The third chair was empty. The treasurer had already taken a plea and agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for zero tolerance toward environmental crimes, leaned over her desk and addressed the room with the kind of cold precision that made even seasoned attorneys sit straighter. We are here to finalize sentencing for the individuals found responsible for the unauthorized drainage of a protected water body, falsification of regulatory documentation, and misappropriation of community funds. The court finds the evidence presented: emails, forged permits, financial records, and on-site forensic reports sufficient to support the charges. I didn't flinch. I didn't need to. The facts had done their job. Karren's attorney stood and made one last attempt at mitigation. Your Honor, my client acknowledges the mistakes made but insists there was no malicious intent. She acted under the belief that the HOA had jurisdiction and was trying to prevent future liability. The judge cut him off. Intent does not excuse the falsification of government documents or the circumvention of environmental protections. You don't forge a biologist's signature by accident. She turned her gaze on Karren directly. Your actions caused irreversible ecological damage, wasted public resources, and misled hundreds of residents. The court sentences you to 6 months house arrest, 2 years supervised probation, and a mandatory restitution of $75,000 to be paid toward the Lake Restoration Fund. You are also barred from serving in any fiduciary or administrative role in an HOA or nonprofit organization for 10 years. Karren didn't respond. Her jaw was tight, and her hands gripped her lap so hard her knuckles had gone white. The former secretary received community service and a fine. She didn't argue. I watched them leave with slow, stiff movements, heads down, the reality finally landing with full weight. That was the last time I saw either of them in public. Outside the courthouse, a group of residents had gathered not with signs or chants, but with quiet nods and murmurs of relief. A few shook my hand as I passed. Most just gave a wordless look that said more than speeches ever could. Back in Brookridge, the cleanup had already begun. The interim board, now made up of engineers, teachers, and longtime homeowners who didn't care for power plays, had taken over with a clear mandate: transparency, accountability, and no more unilateral decisions. Linda, now acting president, called me one afternoon while I was sorting through a delivery of wetland grasses I'd ordered for the far bank. "We've finished the audit," she said. "The misused funds totaled over $120,000. We've already frozen the remaining accounts while we file for damages." I asked her how the residents took the news. They're furious, but this time not at each other. They're channeling it into something useful. We've had volunteers sign up for everything: trail maintenance, water quality testing, even a community garden on the West Bluff. I paused, then said, "You ever think we needed the shake-up?" "Not like this," she replied. "But yeah, maybe we did." The next board meeting was held at the local church's community hall. We didn't have a clubhouse anymore, not until the environmental review was complete and the county lifted the restriction. But nobody missed it. When I entered, the room quieted, not out of tension but respect. Linda stood at the front, smiled, and turned the mic toward me. "Elias, we were hoping you'd accept a formal role as environmental advisor to the board. Voluntary, of course, but given everything you've done," I raised a hand. "I appreciate it. But I think I'm better where I am on the waterline, not behind a desk. I'll help when needed, but I'm not looking to be anyone's boss." A few chuckles rolled through the room. One of the kids from the east side raised his hand. "Are the fish coming back?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. "They will. Give it one good season." That spring, we held the first Community Lake Day in over a year. No permits, no clipboards, no fine print. Just food trucks, folding chairs, and a local band that played for tips and dinner. Kids splashed in the shallows. Someone floated a cooler full of sodas across on an inflatable turtle. I taught a neighbor's daughter how to cast a line without hooking her own ear. And just before sunset, as the water turned gold and the reeds swayed in a soft breeze, I saw something that made every fight, every document, every sleepless night worth it. A line of ducks, small, freshly hatched, paddled out from the far bank, their mother leading them in a quiet formation across the lake. People stopped what they were doing just for a moment to watch. No one said anything. They didn't have to. The lake was ours again. And this time, it wasn't just wetland and water. It was proof that no matter how deep the damage, with enough truth, time, and grit, some things could be restored.